All right, and welcome back to the Belonging Network Summit. Our next guest is a friend, mentor, and DEI champion, Jess Pettitt, who is author of Good Enough Now. For those of you who are not familiar with Jess's work, she pulls together her stand-up comedy years with 15 plus years of diversity training in a wide range of organizations to serve groups to move from abstract fears to actionable habits that lead teams to want to work together. Jess's leadership enables those she works with to feel a sense of belonging and understanding by taking more risks with their ideation, conserving precious resources through collaboration, and maintaining real connections over time. Jess is also an incredibly talented speaker who often shares her own diversity story, winning over hearts and minds of professionals all around the world. For our conversation today, Jess will share her take on what a diversity story is, why it matters, and how it can move apathetic bystanders to step up and serve as belonging champions. Throughout our conversation, we'll also gain some strategies on how to identify, refine, and share our own diversity stories with confidence. So with that, Jess, welcome to the summit.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This has been a really wonderful experience.
Yeah, this is great. So we're on our fourth day. We're talking about diversity stories. And, one of your many professional superpowers is in the area of sharing your own diversity story with humor. And whether you're speaking from the stage or in your writing. So to better frame our conversation, can you share your working definition of what a diversity story is?
Well, I think that it's such a powerful question to start off with, because a diversity story seems mundane and dumb. So then you just make it like so much more complicated because you're like, oh, well, I'm a hot mess. That can't be a diversity story. So then you start like figuring out like which check boxes are the most applicable, who's missing from a list, and then you start editing the story and doing that. All that does is completely silence your diversity story. So my definition of a diversity story is being curious, generous, vulnerable, and authentic. And when that is what you're leading with, then who I am, how I am, what I'm conscious to, what I'm unconscious of, all can come out and be present. And then that's the connection of belonging in the story.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful. So just kind of those four kind of values, I guess, that you have when you craft your story is curiosity, generosity, vulnerability, and authenticity. We love those words. That's why we're all here. So, I really appreciate that definition. It's simple and it kind of takes, as you say, some of our natural inclination to overcomplicate things and just kind of hones it back in. So, now that you've shared the definition, can you think of a specific example of how you have personally leveraged your storytelling skills as a vehicle for creating a more inclusive workplace? And, maybe it's working with a client or, back in your days when you were working for someone else, how were you able to use your story to instantly make a connection and see that kind of light bulb moment happen with a leader that you're working with?
Yeah, so I have this amazing ability of answering your question backwards, and this will be a pattern probably. So I don't think I consciously did this until I realized that my sense of belonging would get fired up when I was able to connect to someone else telling me their truth, even if their truth had nothing to do exactly with my life. So doing diversity work, I go to a lot of retreats where people share their pain and suffering and we work through it together, etc. And after like 3 or 4 of these things, I realized that I don't know these people's names, months, years later. I can't remember the details of their story, but pain is pain and suffering is suffering. And there's a sense of belonging that can happen because of that pain, where not just that we belong in the pain, but that we belong in the healing of each other's pain, right? So I know that that's kind of a big conceptual idea, but for me, the light bulb was when I realized that it doesn't matter what causes the pain or where we're at in our healing process, but that ultimately that's the connection. So then that freed me up to not quite fit in. And there's an ongoing joke in my personal and professional development that I've always been an outlier. But the bonus of being an outlier is there's so many of us out here, yes. Right? Mm-hmm. So when I began to like disclose, like, let's say like my coming out story, right? So like I didn't come out until I was 27 years old. I was the only human being in my life who had no idea that I was queer. And when I did come out, there was no fanfare. Everyone was kind of like, yeah, duh. But for me, I was so nervous and so anxious and so like bent up about it that I was worried about doing it right and if I was lesbian enough. And that since when I then also worked when I worked in college and university campuses, providing assistance and support for people when they were coming out, what I realized is that everyone seems to struggle with this kind of idea of what they're supposed to fit into. And that idea, I think that the downside of some diversity stories or diversity trainings is that you're not supposed to have that idea. But I actually think that idea makes you feel like you have something to aspire to. And then when you're like, hey, I don't fit in, I don't know what to do, that's when you realize who you are. Mm-hmm. And in who you are, that very difference of the kind of avatar that you think you are is where you can then connect and belong with other people.
Yeah.
So if I share details of my own identity development experience, all I'm doing is giving permission for everyone else to have this unique experience. Mm-hmm. Now we belong.
Yeah. Yeah, I like this idea too, where you were talking about hearing from other people, talking about their pain, but also the journey to healing, and that you may not necessarily share those exact experiences, but somehow through the storytelling, you're able to kind of imagine yourself in the shoes of that person as they're sharing the story. Mm-hmm. And that's the bridge of building empathy, right? Right. I like how you frame that. I think that's really smart. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about your book a little bit. So in Good Enough Now, you write about the head, heart, action model, which I really appreciate. Mm-hmm. So first, can you take a moment just to describe this model for folks that aren't familiar with it? And then share with us how it relates to knowing our audience and deciding what part of our diversity stories we believe are purposeful to share in that particular moment, depending on what we're learning about who's in front of us.
Mm-hmm. The idea of head, heart, action is not rocket science by any means. I would actually say that it kind of evolved in my consciousness when I was really getting very burnt out on doing diversity trainings. And I began hearing patterns of my audience members. So as a professional speaker or consultant, I'm in front of audiences all the time. And the people who were coming to me were telling me, and this is probably 3 or 4 years ago now, but they were telling me reasons that they could no longer engage with other people who were different than them or across difference or people with different stories. And their reasoning behind just, I can't do this anymore. Like, maybe I could do this and this, but I definitely can't do this and this anymore. And when I heard that, it was easy for me to kind of dismiss them as excuses. But what I realized is those reasons, one, kind of fit into these 3 categories, and 2, so did mine. Mm-hmm. My burnout and my reasoning of like, I don't want to do this anymore. Like, there's a connection between me feeling like I'm not good enough that is deeply rooted in my identities and my experiences, but also my, for lack of better words, comfort in discomfort of working with people who are different than me. And there's a saying that I've been saying for the last 2.5 years is, thank goodness this happened when Obama was president and not when Trump was president. So then I was able to like heal from my burnout and get all fired up again. And lo and behold, my diversity story is needed more now than I think it was 3 years ago. And I can inspire other people to do it. So then the model becomes kind of the, how do you do it? So like, what's your part of the story? And then how I liked in your question is then once you have some consciousness, or I use the language of responsible for who and how you are. Mm-hmm. So once you can claim that responsibility, you then can look at the people that you're dealing with and see how they are similar or different to the way that you even engage in a story, regardless of social identities or experience or age or race, sexuality, gender. So heady is detail oriented, not necessarily smarts, but if someone's really specific vocabulary words, details, budget lines, bylaw numbers, whatever, some people need that to feel comfortable. So if you're not a details kind of person and you're working with someone who is, you can sprinkle them in and help them feel like they belong instead of that they're just frustrated because they don't have the details they need, especially if they're not self-aware enough to realize what a hang-up their dependence on details is. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But you can't do that unless you know where you are with your need or lack thereof of details. The hardy part isn't empathy or feelings, because I think those are just generally present. But what I mean by heart is ideas. So when I work with companies or associations, some people are doing this work because they deeply believe in the mission or the values of the work.
Yeah.
So it's no longer about the details. It's about the why we're here. It's the because that we all show up in the morning. So then that because can like motivate them through staff changes or hiring freezes or something like this, because they're connected to the because.
Yeah.
And then there's other people that like, it's not really about the details. It's not really about the because. They just want stuff to do, right? So I make a joke that action people are the ones who own pickups and ladders, right? But we burn them out because we make them sit through meetings of details and like figure out what our mission statement is, and they just want to like do stuff.
Yeah.
So all three of these variables are in everyone, and our life has taught us which ones to use or to deploy to feel safe and secure. And then we can also look for those in other people so that we can connect and then get to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for walking through the model. And I want to connect this to then how to craft our own diversity stories. And I wanted to first just touch on the fact that, I mean, you are a really, really gifted public speaker. And, you know, I've personally watched you in action and inspire others, you know, from the stage. And so, you know, when thinking about your model, how does this factor in when you're writing content for keynote speeches, where your goal is absolutely, I want to inspire the leaders in this room to build more inclusive organizations. I want to inspire everyone else, regardless of if they're a capital L leader or otherwise, just to take some kind of action. So, I mean, it's hard when you don't necessarily know who will show up, right? So how do you kind of build in these different strategies to connect with people, knowing that some people are very heart-centered, other people are very heady, action-oriented? Yeah.
Well, it can be hard if you are trying to customize to each individual that you don't know about in advance. That sounds impossible.
Yes.
So then what if you just plan accordingly and make sure that what you say has the details, has the ideas and the concepts and the connections, and also follows through with some action steps, you know? So I like to think about, I mean, I'm obsessed with politics, but like if we look at politicians, when they're running for office, they have to have some kind of like slogan or advertisement and marketing. They have some kind of like tagline or something. And really good ones will include head, heart, and action-oriented pieces. And you can do that in advance with some consciousness of this is what the listeners are going to need from the story I'm about to tell. Whether you are saying good news or bad news, I help a lot of associations and corporations write apology statements. So there's been like a privacy breach, something horrible's happened. Who knows what it is? They have to write an apology. But can you apologize in a way that shows the exact actions that you're taking because it's against your values? And this is exactly what happened and what damage has been done.
Yes.
A good apology statement can do that.
Yes.
So then if you're going to give your annual treasurer's report, why can't you do that there? If you're going to announce a hiring freeze, why can't you do that there? If you're going to tell someone that you're going to break up with them, why can't you do that there? If you're going to, you know, tell your kid that you're throwing them a surprise party, why can't you do that there? So then you can provide the information in a way that's not just considerate of how other people might take it, but it's intentional because you have embraced the fact that we are different and we have different needs and different lived experiences. And so what a gift to be able to get really good at this, even when you don't know the specifics of who you're talking to. Then you can provide that space where then everyone all of a sudden feels connected and listened to and heard. And now you're encouraging them to do the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's, it's really helpful to hear your process when you're thinking about, writing a message, you're about to give a speech, and you're considering, all different types of people and what motivates them. Mm-hmm. And I think for folks that might not necessarily be speaking from the stage, but thinking about, okay, I'm a belonging champion. I want to bring other folks along. I want to kind of persuade some of the more apathetic bystanders. And so of what I know of this particular person, they're more detail oriented. So I'll take that part of my message, that kind of like the trilogy of head, heart, and action, and just kind of
I call it the trifecta.
The trifecta. I love that. Yeah. Right. But it's just kind of, and you have the advantage if you're just trying to talk one person to one person rather than 100 people in a room. You're likely to have a relationship with that person and have a little insight of what really does motivate them. So I think that's super helpful. So, many of us who are tuning in right now intuitively understand that being more vulnerable and more human at work is better for everyone. Yet I'm curious from your perspective, how do you encourage folks to move past their fears and open up through considering their own lived experience, their own diversity story, and how to best share it with colleagues in the workplace? So it's not like the first time they're sharing it and super raw, but they've given it thought, they've considered how best to deliver it, when it's appropriate. But once all of those factors are there, how do you move past that fear of like, oh, this feels really vulnerable and I'm not sure how people will receive it?
So it's a trick question because you don't move past the fear, right? So if we can parallel fear to addiction issues, right? So I've been sober for 15 years, which is a very long time. And it also notes how long we have been friends because I was not sober when we became friends, right? So what's interesting is I don't drink alcohol anymore, but I'm still an alcoholic, right? And you don't ever get to be not an alcoholic, even though you don't drink. And my addiction tendencies just move to something more socially acceptable, right? Which is why I have an entire closet full of shoes I don't wear, right? So same thing goes with fear, is that removing alcohol from my life didn't cure my need to numb whatever feelings I'm numbing. And until I do the work around the feelings that I'm numbing and why I feel the need to do the numbing, I'm just going to numb them with something else.
Yeah.
So I think the beauty of a diversity story is the fear and is also the work you have done to overcome some fears and noticing where the fear has shown up in some other place, right? So my whole tactic is, even the concept of belonging, you don't want it to just be a mural. So we can do that and then be like, wow, that's really big. I don't know what that means. So get really teeny tiny. I had a conversation this morning about vacation messages, like the away message you set up on your email. Can you do something that auto replies when you are not in your office that makes the person who received that read it, know who you are, and feel seen and heard in your absence?
Right.
And we had this whole conversation about it, and I get business off my vacation messages because I use head, heart, and action related things in my vacation message. So one is, I deserve some reflection time. I am going off the grid. Thank you for letting me do this. If you still have urgency messages or you need to talk to somebody, here's a phone number of someone who will answer your questions in my absence. So details, right? And good for me. If you're interested in also taking a little mini vacation, I link to a live video camera of the otters at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. So you can click here and take a little mini vacation and watch otters being fed.
Can we get an example of one of your vacation messages? Because I feel like that would be so great for participants to kind of like actually see it. But
yeah, 100%.
That's brilliant. Yeah,
And what's funny is, so going back to fear, I promise I'm answering your question.
Yes.
We think that fear is unprofessional. So then we like hurry to get through it, or we think we leave it in the parking garage. But the reality is that our coworkers, even I work by myself and I am my own colleague and my own coworker, which is terrifying. But your actual human coworkers, they know when you are ill. They know when you're getting a divorce. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they know that stuff before you do. Yeah. You're not actually leaving anything behind. So then we think we have this avatar of ourselves, and then we're trying to get the avatar to belong. And the reality is that that's the broken system. Right. So then all you have to do is just be yourself in the vulnerable, authentic, generous, curious kind of way. I think it's important to understand that we're all terrified of each other. So what that means is that you ultimately are scared of me. So, here's a basic Buddhist principle, but if I want to be less scared, then my job is to make other people feel less scared. Mm-hmm. By making other people feel less scared, I'm making them feel like they belong. And then all of a sudden I'm surrounded by people that feel like they belong to me. Yeah. I will feel like I belong.
Yes. This is super powerful. Let's go to thinking about leaders now. Let's turn our attention to leaders who have been in the workplace for maybe a couple of decades, and the style of leadership that they developed into was one where this idea of professionalism was just all business all the time. Sharing anything that was personal was not meant to be in the workplace. So in this era of being more vulnerable, sharing a little bit more about things that influenced who you are and how you got to the role as leader in the workplace, and what younger professionals want to hear is, how did you get there? Tell us about some of your failures and trying to connect to be human. How do you inspire those folks to, one, understand the power of their own diversity stories, and then two, inspire them to give it a go?
To answer backwards again is paying attention to which pieces you don't feel safe sharing. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's easy to kind of say that, like, well, I just operate under an old school definition of professionalism. But the reality is that there are people that cannot share the truth about their life at work because they don't feel safe to. So then if collectively we all just practice with, what do I not feel safe sharing at work, right? So maybe I'm thinking about my friend who his wife had a really hard time getting pregnant. It was very frustrating and very expensive, and finally was able to get pregnant, carried the baby almost to term, and she and the baby were in the hospital, and she almost died and the baby almost died. So they both were in the hospital full time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 9 weeks. Wow. Meanwhile, the father is working at a job that he doesn't like, and he would have quit before, but he needed the health insurance because she was having such a hard time getting pregnant. Then she got pregnant. Well, now he needs the health insurance to get through the pregnancy and the birth. And then the birth was so scary and terrible. He still has to go to work, but he now has to be at work, cannot get fired, cannot get laid off, and get as many extra hours as possible when he hasn't slept in more than 9 weeks.
Right.
And he didn't feel like he belonged at work. He can't tell that story. Right. He is a white Christian heterosexual man who typically, shares about his vacations and has family pictures in his office, etc. And all of a sudden something happens and he can't share it. That is a better learning tool than me talking about subordinated or marginalized people who can or cannot feel that they share certain parts at work. I did some consulting work with a car dealership, but I was supposed to come in and address, coincidentally, 2 different people, vice president of sales and one of the really good mechanics, both were high achievers, and all of a sudden they just weren't achieving anymore. So the owner asked me to come in and do one-on-ones and figure it out. Mm-hmm. So I'm doing one-on-ones, and it turns out both of these humans are undergoing chemotherapy.
Wow.
They haven't told anybody at work that they're going through chemotherapy because they're afraid people are going to think they're lazy. Mm-hmm. Well, what ends up happening is their coworkers thought they were lazy because they're taking extra long lunches, they're leaving early. And this is a dealership that, according to the mural on the wall, runs like a family.
Right.
So then I asked for their permission. I disclosed this to the owner. The owner's like, I had no idea. And very quickly, they created carpooling and food support and things like that because that's what the family means.
Yeah.
When people are scared to say something, it is the best equalizer when you realize there are other people here who are scared to say something.
Yeah.
So you can't force people to share, but you can recognize how small it can feel when you can't bring all of yourself to work.
Absolutely. I mean, if you could just take that one step of, well, one, kind of recognizing that the fear is there, like you said, and we're terrified, of how other people will receive us. But if we are the first to take the step to kind of share a little bit that feels like a risk, it's amazing how people receive it, right?
Right, and I used like negative medical examples, but like, what if you won the blue ribbon on Friday night at the rodeo with your rabbits, right? There may be people at work who don't even know you keep rabbits, but like, do you get an opportunity to showcase and brag your rabbits and your blue ribbons, right? Or maybe you got to an orange belt, or your kid actually like passed a math test, right? Like, there's a lot of different things that are so epically important to us as a human, and those moments belong to us. Yeah. And then we create these systems where we think they're inappropriate to share.
Right. I mean, this is really important. When you think about the kind of barrier of not sharing this, like things that are central to us, how do we shift that, right? I mean, on the positive side, right? I mean, where do we build that in? Any guidance on that for folks that are like, yeah, I want to share about my kid acing a math test or about my bunnies, but what are some strategies that you share with folks when they feel kind of stuck of like, when is it appropriate or when is it too much information?
I mean, I would operate under the assumption somebody already feels like they can't share. Mm-hmm. I would also operate on the assumption that somebody is already oversharing something people don't want to know about.
Yeah.
Then there's the realities of like actual discrimination, prejudice, bias, things like that can happen based on what people do share.
Right.
And collectively, I don't think it gets changed one conversation at a time. But if this is important to you, and if you are in a capital L leader or a lowercase L leader role, you can pay attention. And even if you're not a supervisor or a manager and you're working in a small group, you can dictate what's the culture of that small group inside of the context of a big giant machine, right? Like there's a reason I took off the shirt I was wearing and put on this cute little dress, this little cardigan, right? Is because I knew you would be in a tie. I needed to kind of like match, right?
Right.
I also have dogs that are barking because I'm being recorded, and that's how karma works. Yeah. But my dogs are my children, so I'm not going to get mad about that.
Right.
You may remember a couple of years ago, there was an expert on Korean history who was being interviewed on the BBC, and his daughter came into the interview on camera. Do you remember that?
Yeah. Right? But maybe not everyone knows. So,
right. He's talking about Korean history and military deployment in Korea. He is an expert on Korea. He's being interviewed live on the BBC, and his daughter comes like wobbling in, all super proud of herself, followed quickly by an infant in a little wheeled thing, followed very quickly by his wife who's trying to get the kids out because this is a big deal, like his dream. He's being interviewed live on television. And what I thought was so powerful about it is that, of course, it was funny, right? Because it's unexpected. The timing was funny. Yes, there were lots of articles you can Google about like his wife was Korean and like what does that mean? And people thought she was the nanny instead of the wife. And like you can talk about biracial relationships. Yes, you can do all of that. And there's also a reality that like men with children get a more positive like, oh, than women dealing with children, right? Like all of those things are true and an interesting conversation. And he wasn't fired. The BBC article didn't lose its import, right? Like part of our fear is that if we change our definition, we might change our culture. Then people spend all this money asking me, well, how do we change our culture without changing our definitions?
Yeah.
Well, it's not writing me checks, right? Yeah. But like, we can start there. Sure. Feel free. But the reality is that we're going to have to change our definition of the culture. So again, using this kind of concept of diversity story is, can your culture have a diversity story that already exists of the people who are in it that you're just not hearing? You're just not providing space to listen to those pieces. And can you honor and role model and start it even in just the one-on-one meeting you have that has no power to shift everything, but just this moment of listening? I can do that.
Yeah.
And if you're scared to start at work, start at the grocery store with somebody you're probably never going to see again.
Yeah.
You see someone and engage in a conversation with them. You know, yesterday, somebody in front of me bought artichokes. I'm totally intimidated to cook artichokes. So I just asked her, what do you do with those?
Yeah.
Next thing you know, we're exchanging recipes, whatever. Okay, great. She belonged in that moment as the expert. And I belonged as someone who really would like to enjoy some artichokes.
Yes. Maybe we'll share that recipe as well. I really like this concept that you're talking about, and just kind of those simple one, like where to practice it, right? I mean, you don't necessarily have to take a risk that feels high stakes and you're not sure if there's any reward to it in the workplace. So why not the grocery store to test it out? And when you feel like you have a little bit more confidence, thinking about places to start in the workplace. And I like that idea of just like a one-on-one meeting. You know, if you're a manager or supervisor role, just kind of opening up space before the meeting for like 5 minutes of just like, hey, what happened over the weekend? Or, you know, what's going on? What's the weather like? I mean, something just to start the conversation and build a connection. It starts with you sharing a story.
Yeah. I'm getting ready to go to a professional conference next week, and I'm always laughing that it's a professional conference of professional speakers. So we're supposed to be good at this, right? Yeah. And what ends up happening is people look over people's shoulders to try to talk to somebody else. So then you feel like you're not good enough for whoever's on the other side of you. No one tends to say goodbye or like close out a conversation. So I have made a concerted effort to make eye contact and not look around the person I'm talking to. Yeah. And if they have to go, or if I have to go, to say like, hey, Rhodes, it was really great connecting with you. Yeah. That is all. And it has completely shifted how I experience this event.
Yeah.
Also, we don't say, okay, so what do you do? Right? Like, I like to start with like, what was your biggest lesson this year?
Yeah.
Right? Like yeah. What's the coolest thing you've read lately?
Yes. Yeah.
Like, ask better questions.
Yes.
That's not hard.
Completely agree with that. Yes. I love that. Okay, so let's go back. Let's think about the audience members right now. For those folks that have never considered their own lived experiences as a source material for sharing their diversity story, can you offer some expert coaching on how they might go about excavating the story, refining it, getting the confidence to share it with other folks in the workplace?
Sure. Number one, do not judge a story about your own life next to another story of somebody else who has probably told that story before. Right? Yeah. Like, that's just stupid. So like when people are, you know, the bridesmaid or the best man at a wedding and they have to give a toast, the first thing people do is seemingly watch famous orators give speeches. Well, yeah. Why would you do that? You don't teach a 15-year-old how to drive by taking them to NASCAR, right?
Yeah.
And all that would do is make them good at turning left anyway, right? So you have to start someplace realistic. So one of the things that I usually suggest when I'm working with people or doing coaching bits around speaking is, what is a story that has happened to you? There's not other players. It is a one-person show. Something funny that has happened to you that made you happy at the end of it. So start with funny, start with happy, and start with only one person. Right? So like, I was walking my dog the other day and I saw a little teeny tiny mushroom growing out of the middle of a crack in the sidewalk. It was super cute, and I stopped and looked at it, and there was a grasshopper on top of it. It made me laugh.
Yeah.
That is not a funny story. No one else outside of me is going to find that funny.
Yeah.
If anything, in that pause, you're like...
I was wondering, like, should I be laughing right now or not? So, okay.
No, but that's exactly the point. But I've identified something that was important to me.
Yeah.
Right? And sure, maybe that's like a little window into how weird of a human being I am. I left out the part that I look at the grasshopper and my dog immediately ate the grasshopper and the mushroom, right? Which is also kind of funny, right?
Yeah.
But the practice piece is that you notice you. Mm-hmm. You notice what you notice.
Right.
And that's something that we don't do. We think about when we have to craft a story or tell our diversity story, we immediately picture everyone in the audience and try to figure out what they're going to like because we want their approval. But the reality is we haven't even approved of ourselves yet. You know, it's just like if somebody you really think is cute and they ask you out on a date, some of the first things you do is go buy new clothes. Mm-hmm. Well, they asked you as you are. They have already seen your clothes probably, right? So this is literally the concept of being good enough now.
Yes.
And it is ironic that I wrote the book called Good Enough Now because I also am constantly insecure and lack the confidence of just like doing everything. And I'm the one who wrote the book literally called Good Enough Now. Yeah. The whole mantra is my mantra, and that is to do the best you can with what you've got some of the time, because that's better than nothing never.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So what can you notice about yourself that maybe is a little window into who you really are as a person? And then can you get in the habit of noticing that about yourself so that you can provide the space for someone else to share those stories.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah. And it goes back to what we're talking about with authenticity, but giving some concrete examples behind that. And it's, you know, I think it goes back to your vacation message of self-reflection. You've got to have that time to look inward to figure out, you know, what about kind of my experiences over time are meaningful to me first and foremost. And, you know, what can I share about these stories to connect with other people you know, so that they can see my full self, you know, in the workplace or at the grocery store or wherever you are. So I really appreciate that. For the folks like the recalcitrant leader who is encouraged to get vulnerable and share their story, you know, who claims that they don't have a diversity story to share, what do you say to that person?
Probably would have to get bleeped out. So I'll edit it. There's no way you haven't had a diverse experience. And I would challenge you to note the limitation of your own definition. So there's an activity in my book, and if people are interested, they can download all the activities for free. If you go to goodenoughnow.com/freebies.
Here it is.
Freebie. But I ask people to make a list of their crucible moments in their life. Mm-hmm. And what's amazing is that people interpret this as all of the negative things they have survived. Huh. So it becomes this resilience, perseverance thing. I just asked for like the crucible moments. Mm-hmm. Like, why do they all have to be negative? Right? Yeah. So then they go back to their list and they start adding other things. I just did another workshop where I was a participant, and they asked us to challenge ourselves to make a list of I've done it's. So not a to-dos, but like to-dones, done-it lists. Yeah. And I had to make a list of all of the successes I have experienced. Mm-hmm. And it was really hard because I'm more used to sourcing out, when we were talking earlier about pain and fear and suffering, right? I'm more used to that. But how much pain and suffering exists that if I'm not able to hold what an amazing, incredible experience I have also had in those positive moments or those moments of growth or joy or laughter or something. Mm-hmm. And that's the work I need to do on myself.
Yeah.
So you used a 75-cent word, Notre Dame, NYU. And I think if someone is hesitant to believe that they matter, then it's going to be hard for you to tell a diversity story because you don't understand how your mattering is actually what makes someone feel like they belong to you. You already make people feel like they belong. It's just whether or not you're going to take responsibility for that. Right. And when you engage in that sense of responsibility, you can do it even more because now you're doing it intentionally and consciously.
Yeah. This is all good stuff. So I'm curious, I've had a number of questions for you. At this point of the interview, thinking about our participants, what might be one thing about diversity storytelling that we haven't yet covered that you feel strongly that our audience may not know, but they ought to know?
Other than the definition of recalcitrant?
the reluctant, the people who dig in their heels, they do not. Yeah.
Marty makes Marty pants.
Yes.
What do I think people need to know? I'm 45 years old and I'm still learning the lessons that it may seem like I'm teaching you. Mm-hmm. There's millions more that I don't know. And I've just gotten more comfortable with the discomfort that I don't know things.
Yeah.
And there's some kind of beauty freed up in that. Mm-hmm. That I don't actually have to tell a diversity story so that I become more competent. I tell a diversity story so that my incompetence can be transformed into just ignorance. So then I can learn and I can pick and choose what to keep or to edit or become self-aware of kind of the incongruent pieces that make me me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it goes back to one of the words you used in the beginning of the interview, this idea of curiosity and also humility, right? Where you're in this position of power where you are sharing what you know as you continue to learn and just recognizing that the learning doesn't stop at 45 or 40 or whenever you started doing the work, right? It's kind of this new model of inclusive leadership where you're surrounding yourself, with other peers in the field, just kind of being open to how they approach this work. And I think that's one of the powers of this particular summit is we're coming together. There's 30 some thought leaders that look at this work, kind of these 5 themes that we're talking about over the week and radically different approaches. And each one is amazing, but they're all super different. And so I really appreciate that response. And I think that's like how you responded to that question is a really good model for those folks on this, participating in the summit who are the capital L leaders, where it's okay. You don't have to be, I was raised Catholic. You don't have to be the infallible Pope of knowing everything, And
even popes have clearly changed their minds about things.
Yes, right, exactly. And that's
I haven't thought about that. Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. It's that evolution, right? And I think that's really powerful for leaders in particular to hear. So I'm really grateful that you shared that. Okay, Jess. So you're doing awesome work. I would love for you to share with the audience where people can find you, like the best place online to find you, your work, and to learn more about the book itself.
Sure. So you usually can find me in the dairy aisle. But if you mean online, go to goodenoughnow.com and the book and the blog and all that stuff is there. I try really hard under this kind of interpretation of diversity, story, and belonging. I have a monthly newsletter that I every single month say, I'm never going to write this thing again, because it's just so boring because it's just like, well, this is where I screwed up this month. But I find that that newsletter is probably the best place where my diversity story gets aired out a little bit regularly every month, which is probably why I constantly think I'm going to quit it. It's called Another Isolated Incident. Which also talks to kind of our shock and awe of the exact same thing happening over and over again. But I would recommend that as a free resource or tool as well. And that's just at goodenoughnow.com.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's the best thing.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Jess, for your time. It's always a pleasure to, take an hour out of the day or so and just learn more about what you're up to and to be able to share your genius with the audience. So I hope for everyone who tuned in, you have a lot of practical strategies of how to think about your own stories and to get some of that extra boost of confidence to be okay with being good enough now and giving it a try. So for additional supplemental information like workbooks and strategies on sharing our diversity stories, some of the artichoke recipes that Jess was mentioning, you can find all of that on our website. So definitely check that out. And for now, let's continue building workplace cultures of belonging. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
For everyone watching, thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget, if you want more time with these talks, if you'd like additional resources for doing this work in your organizations, and if you'd like to join our community calls after the summit, you can check out our options for getting extended access to all of the sessions and other helpful goodies using the link below. Every purchase also helps me pay the speakers for their generosity, wisdom, and labor in helping us grow the belonging movement. Thank you, and thanks again to today's featured belonging champion.